I thought I was just renting a room, but every night, her smile, her voice, and her warning, "Stay quiet, these walls are thin," pulled me deeper into a silence that felt louder than desire itself. The first time I saw her, I was standing in the narrow hallway of the old apartment building, still holding the last box from my car. The place smelled faintly of coffee and polished wood, like a house that had been lived in for years, not just rented out. I knocked on the door, and when she opened it, I forgot, for a moment, about the weight in my arms. She was nothing like I expected a landlady to be. Mid-40s, maybe, but carrying herself with a quiet kind of elegance that made the hallway feel smaller just because she was standing in it. Her hair fell in soft waves around her face, and though she smiled politely, there was something behind her eyes, a steadiness, the kind of composure that comes only with time. "Welcome," she said, her voice low, even, the kind of tone that could quiet a restless room. She reached out her hand, and I shifted the box awkwardly to take it. Her palm was cool, her grip steady, and I felt the briefest pause before she let go. Just long enough for me to notice. She led me inside, pointing out the kitchen, the creak in the hallway floorboard, the thin walls I'd later learn far too much about. I followed, trying not to stare, but every detail seemed sharper than it should have been, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear as she spoke, the soft perfume that lingered when she passed by me, the curve of her smile when she caught me looking at the shelves lined with books instead of the apartment itself. "This place is old," she said with a small laugh, resting her hand on the kitchen counter as if it was an old friend. "It listens. Sometimes too well." I didn't know what she meant then, not really, but the words stuck with me. As she handed me the keys, our fingers brushed. A small thing, but in the stillness of that apartment, it felt louder than it should have. I caught the flicker of her eyes meeting mine, then moving away again, as if reminding herself, or me, of a boundary neither of us had spoken aloud. When she finally left me alone to unpack, the silence pressed in. I could still hear the memory of her voice, low and steady, echoing faintly in my head. I didn't know then what those walls would carry. I only knew that the apartment, with all its creaks and shadows, already felt less empty because she had walked through it. And I had the strange, unshakable sense that this was not going to be just another rental. It didn't take long for life in the old building to find its rhythm. The walls really were thin, just as she had warned, and though I told myself to ignore it, I couldn't help but notice the quiet patterns of her life seeping into mine. I would hear the faint clink of dishes at odd hours, or the gentle scrape of a chair being pulled back across the wooden floor. Sometimes, late at night, laughter drifted through the walls, not loud, but warm, touched with that husky edge her voice seemed to carry when she was at ease. It was the kind of sound that made me smile without realizing, though I never admitted that to her. Our paths began to cross more often than coincidence should allow. Once, she left a stack of books on the counter by the communal kitchen, a note scribbled on the top one, "If you read them, return them here." The next morning, when I brought the first book back, she was already there, rinsing out her coffee cup. "Finished so soon?" she teased, glancing at the book in my hand. "Just the first chapter," I admitted, setting it down. But I couldn't leave it half open. Her smile lingered, small but real, before she turned back to the sink. That became our quiet exchange, books, mugs, dishes passed back and forth as if we shared more than just walls. I started to notice the little things about her. The way she leaned against the doorframe when she was tired, one shoulder resting lazily as she spoke. The soft perfume that followed her when she brushed by me in the hall, faint but impossible to miss. And most of all, the way her eyes held mine a second too long, as if she was weighing something she'd never say. One evening, as I came in from work, the light spilling from her living room drew me to pause. Through the half-open door, I caught a glimpse of her curled up with a book, lamp glow soft against her face. She didn't see me, and I moved quickly past, heart racing with the guilty thrill of having seen her unguarded. We didn't speak much in those moments, not really. Our words were careful, measured, the kind of conversations that skimmed the surface, weather, errands, the quirks of the old building. But beneath the restraint, there was something else. A quiet pull. A tension not in what we said, but in what we didn't. Each time her hand brushed mine when passing a plate, or when our shoulders touched briefly in the narrow hallway, it felt deliberate, not accidental, not careless. And though neither of us spoke of it, the silence between us grew heavier, carrying more meaning than words could manage. It was in those silences that I first began to realize, we weren't just sharing walls. We were sharing something far more fragile. It was nearly midnight when I heard the knock. Soft, almost uncertain, but clear enough against the old wooden door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and for a moment I just sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the sound of rain sliding down the windows. Then the knock came again, lighter this time. When I opened the door, she was there. My landlady. Wrapped in a simple cardigan, hair falling loose around her shoulders, she looked softer than I'd ever seen her. She smiled faintly, one hand brushing against the doorframe. "Sorry," she whispered, her voice carrying that husky edge it sometimes held late at night. "There's a leak in the kitchen pipe again. I thought you might have heard it." I hadn't, but I followed her anyway, padding quietly into the kitchen. The old bulb above us flickered once before holding steady, casting a pale yellow glow over the room. Sure enough, water dripped steadily into a small metal bowl she'd placed beneath the sink. "I've called a plumber, but he won't come until morning," she said. Her words were calm, but her eyes lingered on me in a way that unsettled and steadied me all at once. We stood there longer than necessary, watching the drip of water. The sound seemed louder than it should have been, echoing in the quiet space. She leaned against the counter, and I caught the faint brush of her sleeve against my arm. My breath stilled, aware of how close we were standing. She noticed, I think. Her lips curved into the smallest smile, and in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Stay quiet, these walls are thin." It was meant lightly, I could tell, a half-warning about the noise, perhaps even a playful reminder of the building's quirks. But the way she said it, the way her eyes flickered toward mine as the words slipped out, made it feel like something more. As if she wasn't just talking about the walls, but about us. About this fragile closeness we hadn't yet acknowledged. I swallowed, nodding, though I couldn't bring myself to step back. For a heartbeat, maybe two, we simply stood there in silence. The hum of the refrigerator, the dripping of the pipe, her perfume hanging faintly between us, it all pressed in, making the air feel heavier. Then she straightened, brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear, and the moment passed. She smiled again, softer this time, and thanked me for checking the leak. When she left me in the kitchen, I stayed behind, staring at the slow rhythm of the dripping water. But all I could hear were her words, still echoing in the quiet, "Stay quiet, these walls are thin." And suddenly, the silence didn't feel empty anymore. It felt alive. After that night in the kitchen, something shifted between us. Nothing was said, no lines were crossed, but the silence carried more weight than before. It was as though her words, "Stay quiet, these walls are thin," had planted themselves between us, shaping how we moved around one another. I began to notice her routines with a new kind of attention. The faint hiss of her kettle just past midnight, the light glowing under her door when most of the building was asleep, the creak of her footsteps across the hallway floorboards. They weren't interruptions anymore. They were patterns, quiet signals I'd started to listen for without meaning to. Some nights I'd step into the kitchen for water, only to find her already there, leaning against the counter with a steaming mug in her hands. She'd look up, her expression calm, and with a half-smile she'd tilt her head toward the other cup waiting on the counter. She never said she'd made it for me, but I knew. Those nights were never filled with big conversations. Instead, we spoke in fragments, a line about the book I'd borrowed, a comment about the weather, sometimes nothing at all. And yet, the silences felt fuller than words ever could. It was in the small gestures where the meaning lived. The brush of her fingers against mine when she passed me the sugar bowl. The faint warmth of her shoulder pressing into mine when we stood too close at the counter, neither of us moving away. The way her breath sometimes caught, almost imperceptibly, when I laughed too close to her ear. The old refrigerator hummed steadily, the only sound between our words. Steam curled lazily from her teacup, and once, when I reached for it, my fingertips grazed hers. She didn't pull back immediately. Instead, she let the moment linger, her eyes holding mine as if daring me to notice the silence we had both been protecting. I did notice. I noticed everything. There was no need to speak of it. The air between us was already saying too much. She'd stand a little closer than necessary, and I'd lean in just slightly, enough to feel the faint warmth radiating from her. The tension built not from what we did, but from what we didn't. Every night felt like it was balancing on a fragile thread, one we both refused to cut yet couldn't stop tightening. It was never just tea. Never just small talk. The kitchen became our meeting ground, a place where the hours stretched long and the silence turned into something shared, something secret. And in those quiet nights, I began to understand, we were building a language of our own, one spoken not with words, but with glances, pauses, and the simple act of not pulling away. It was a Thursday night when the silence broke differently. The rain had just eased, leaving the streets damp and shining beneath the lamplight outside. I'd stepped into the kitchen to fill a glass of water, expecting the usual quiet, maybe even the sight of her already waiting there with her tea. Instead, I found her sitting at the small table, an old photograph resting between her hands. She looked up when I entered, and for once, her smile wasn't there. Not the polite one, not the teasing one, not even the quiet curve of amusement I'd grown used to. Just a raw, unguarded look that made me pause in the doorway. "Sorry," she murmured, sliding the photo aside as if she'd been caught. "I didn't mean to." I sat down across from her before she could finish. "You don't have to explain." For a long moment, she studied me, as if deciding how much to give away. Then, with a sigh, she pushed the photo toward me. The edges were frayed, the colors faded, but I could still make out a younger version of her, standing with a man whose arm rested easily across her shoulders. They were smiling, caught in some moment of happiness that belonged to another time. "He was my husband," she said softly. Her fingers brushed the corner of the photograph, not quite steady. "It feels like another life now. He's gone." Her voice didn't break, but it wavered, a tremor I might have missed if I hadn't been listening so closely. I didn't try to fill the silence. Instead, I let it hold, heavy but honest, and waited. She went on, quieter this time. "It's strange, the way time moves. You think you've healed, you think you've put things away neatly, but then a night like this comes and," she trailed off, her eyes dropping to the table. Without thinking too much, I reached forward and laid my hand gently over hers. Her skin was warm, her pulse faint beneath my touch. She didn't pull away. Instead, she turned her hand slightly, her fingertips brushing my palm, and for the first time I felt her vulnerability not as something hidden, but as something shared. When she finally looked up, her gaze was steady, searching mine as though bracing for judgment. All I gave her was silence, a quiet presence, no pity, no answers, just the truth that I was there, listening. Her lips curved into the faintest smile, fragile but real. She slipped the photo back into its envelope and let out a slow breath, as though releasing something she'd held too long. That night, we didn't speak much more. But the distance between us had shifted. The walls hadn't changed, but I knew now, they weren't just thin in sound. They were thin in the way they let us see each other, too clearly, too deeply, when neither of us had planned for it. The night the storm came, the building itself seemed to shiver. Wind rattled the windows, rain beat against the glass in frantic bursts, and the lights flickered so often that I found myself holding my breath each time, waiting for them to go out. When the final flicker left us in darkness, I heard movement in the hallway. A moment later, a soft knock on my door. It was her. She held a candle in one hand, the flame casting a golden glow over her face. The shadows made her look different, almost younger, yet also more fragile. "Power's out," she said simply, her voice steady despite the chaos outside. "Come sit in the living room. It feels less lonely with two." I followed her, and we settled onto the old couch. The storm pressed against the windows, thunder rolling low like some distant warning. The candlelight flickered between us, catching the curve of her cheekbones, the line of her collarbone where her cardigan had slipped open just slightly. We sat close, closer than usual, shoulders brushing with every shift. At first we spoke to fill the air, about the storm, the unreliability of the old wiring, the way the building always groaned in weather like this. But soon, the words faded, replaced by the rhythm of rain and the sound of our breathing. I could feel the warmth of her arm against mine, a steady presence in the dark. Each time the thunder cracked, she leaned just slightly closer, her body seeking comfort she pretended not to need. At one point, her head tilted toward my shoulder, hovering there for a heartbeat before she pulled back, straightening with a small, self-conscious smile. "These walls," she whispered, almost to herself, "they don't forgive a sound." Her words echoed that night in the kitchen, the playful warning, but this time they felt heavier, as though she was reminding herself rather than me. I turned to her, catching the flicker of candlelight in her eyes. For a moment, the silence between us was unbearable, thick, electric, the kind of silence that begs to be broken not with words, but with something more. But she drew in a breath, steadying herself, and looked away. Her hand brushed mine on the couch, lingering for just a second before retreating. The storm outside raged louder, as if mocking our restraint. My chest ached with the nearness of her, the pull of something we both felt but refused to name. Every second stretched long, every pause daring us to close the gap. We didn't. Not that night. Instead, we sat in silence, two shadows cast in candlelight, our closeness undeniable but unspoken. The storm would pass, but the tension it left behind would not. Be why morning, the storm had passed. The streets outside shimmered with puddles that reflected the pale light of dawn, and the air carried that clean, heavy scent only rain can leave behind. The building was still, hushed in a way that felt different from its usual silence, as if the storm had drawn something out of it, leaving a fragile calm in its wake. I found her in the living room, still curled on the couch, the half-burned candle beside her melted into a pool of wax. Her cardigan had slipped from one shoulder, and a thin blanket was draped across her knees. She looked peaceful, though I could see in the faint crease between her brows that sleep had not come easily. When she stirred, her eyes found mine almost immediately, as though she had been aware of me even in her rest. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she gave me a tired smile, not the practiced kind she sometimes wore in the hallways, but something softer, unguarded. Without a word, I sat beside her. The couch dipped gently under our combined weight, bringing us closer until our arms touched. She let out a quiet sigh, and this time, she didn't pull away. Slowly, she leaned into me, her head resting against my chest as though it had been meant to be there all along. I froze for a heartbeat, afraid to move, afraid to break the spell. Then I wrapped an arm around her shoulders, drawing her just slightly closer. Her cheek pressed against me, warm and steady, and in that stillness, I could feel the faint rhythm of her heartbeat. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. Words would have only lessened what was already understood. Her breath slowed, her body relaxing into mine, and I found myself matching the rhythm, letting the silence cradle us both. The walls might have been thin, but at that moment, I realized it didn't matter. This wasn't about hiding, or what others might hear. It was about the quiet trust that had grown between us, stronger than any noise, stronger than the storm. I let my hand rest lightly on her shoulder, my thumb brushing slow circles over the fabric of her cardigan. She didn't flinch. Instead, she shifted closer, the smallest movement, but one that said more than anything she could have whispered. We stayed like that as the morning light spread across the room. No declarations, no promises, just the comfort of silence shared, the kind that speaks only to the two who understand it. And in that silence, I knew, the walls might always be thin, but what we had found between them was thick enough to hold.